What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and we're continuing talking about the new data slate update for Warhammer 40k. Yesterday, I talked about some of the factions that were the worst hit by balance changes in this most recent update. The ones that had the most taken away from them, and the ones that had the most to lose. But today, we're going to be talking about some feel-good stories. Those factions in the game that were doing real bad, but got the biggest improvements in the data slate. These factions largely flew under the radar moving into this update, but may be powers to contend with now going into the new season because they got a lot of updates. And a lot of what we're going to be talking about today are points changes, because that was the tool that the balance team decided to wield with the greatest fervor to try to repair the state of Warhammer 40k. So anyway, let's dive in with our first faction, the Leagues of Votan. Upon release of the edition, Leagues of Votan were plagued by having relatively expensive units, a pretty worthless army mechanic, as well as just pitiful and anemic damage output. It was clear that they were built around their Judgment Token mechanic, but the Judgment Token mechanic was a little bit hard to apply, especially since it required your expensive units to be killed outside of very specific circumstances, and to be honest, probably didn't do enough to counteract the poor offensive stats of many Votan units. Now they've received basically universal points reductions across the entirety of the faction, and Votan players will now find that they probably now have 15 to 20% more points to play with when constructing their army, and that, on the whole, is a good thing. As a faction with as small a stable as Votan does, however, there is a little bit of a downside to having additional points added to your army. You start to introduce new inefficiencies from units that aren't necessarily filling a role, but instead are just being taken because of their points cost. That said, the detachment ability has been updated to allow more access to judgment tokens for the army. Previously, it allowed the Votan player to target a single unit for destruction at the start of the game that would assign that unit 2 judgment tokens and award the Votan player command points depending on what turn they were destroyed. Now, you can choose in a normal Strike Force game, it's a 2,000 point game of Warhammer 40k, up to 4 units to receive those judgment tokens. So those guys are going to be getting a lot more hit and wound bonuses across the breadth of the opponent's army rather than just one. This helps to alleviate the downside of those poor offensive profiles, and with more units now on the table to benefit from that as well, the hope is that the volume of fire that Votan can produce can counteract some of the downsides of the faction as a whole. Definitely a lot more to play with here. It remains to be seen whether that forces Votan up into the upper tiers of the game, but certainly makes them more competitive against the majority of the game rather than being one of, if not the worst faction in 40k in the index season. Moving on to another faction that was kind of in a similar boat with expensive units with poor defensive stats, that was Tau Empire. Now, Tau didn't get any mechanical changes. Nothing about the army was reworked or rewritten. Instead, they were already sort of pushing maybe the mid-tier of the game. You would occasionally see Tau players get up to podium or even get undefeated at events, and Tau had at least one pretty reasonable army archetype. Now, I do want to mention here that there was a core rules change within the rules commentary that did actually nerf Tau a little bit. Technically, if you squinted your eyes and kind of ignored the intention of the rules, Tau were able to unlimitedly guide their units, because shooting with your unit didn't actually make it ineligible to shoot later on in the phase. They just couldn't be chosen to fire their weapons again. But other effects like performing actions or guiding with the Tau army role actually did allow them to do that as well as shooting. That certainly wasn't the intention of the rule. Shooting should have always made you ineligible to shoot, but it's something that the designers forgot, and they did include in the rules commentary in this update. Some communities played it rules as written, where Tau are able to fire and then guide a second unit to get more bonus out of their army ability, although I know a lot of tournaments and a lot of communities who did disallow that. So I don't know exactly how much of a nerf that is, but what is a huge buff are the points values for Tau units. Tau units almost universally have gone down dramatically in points cost, and it looks like the design team very clearly tried to alleviate their problem with high strength weapons by making their high strength weapons, things like Skyray gunships and hammerheads, dramatically less expensive. Skyray gunships themselves went down a staggering 30 points per model. Riptide battlesuits went down 55, and the Storm Surge went down 60. These points changes were felt basically across the entirety of the faction. A fully kitted out Crisis team with a Crisis Commander dropped a massive 40 points to include in your army. Even Fire Warrior teams in Devilfish went down 45 points, losing 25 points off of a Breacher team by itself and 20 points off the tank that they were embarked into. Huge points cuts across the entirety of the faction. And as a faction with a competent game plan and good utility units to begin with, Tau were already poised to be relatively competitive. The problem is that that they just couldn't eke the efficiency out of their lists to be able to do so. But I think now there is a serious chance that they can. So maybe not the most exciting entry in the list, but certainly one to keep an eye on moving into the new season. Now, adding this in as a little bit of an honorable mention for another faction that basically got buffed in a similar way, Grey Knights also got massive points cuts, and were a faction that was poised to do relatively well. While they didn't have the same level of success as Tau Empire, they had a tougher time getting to those upper level placements. Grey Knights were dominant in some matchups, with an almost unparalleled ability to jump around the table and score, and now we'll just simply have more units with which to do that, certainly driving up their potential win rate and faction placement. Whether or not that gets them out of the doldrums of the bottom mid-tier where they were living, we'll have to see, but it is an exciting time if I were a silver-clad knight guy. Last but certainly not least on this list, we have Death Guard. Death Guard were another recipient of basically a full army rework, adding an additional attachment rule that was totally new to the faction to shore up their weaknesses. Their Contagions ability now, in addition to applying a -1 toughness modifier, also applies a modal ability that is chosen the battle formation step of the game. That's the step before the game starts when you choose your reinforcements and what is embarked inside your transports. This allows them to impose either a -1 weapon skill, ballistic skill, -1 save, or -1 leadership and objective control aura on top of that contagion aura. So in addition to the -1 toughness that you're already putting on the enemy. On top of that, Death Guard also got, again, massive points increases across basically the entirety of the faction, with almost all of their most played units, all of their characters, and many of their vehicles dropping in points cost, making the army generically more efficient. A more efficient army that also applies massive debuffs on its enemy, and an army that was specifically hurt very hard by devastating wounds, relying on good saving characteristics to keep units like its Terminators alive, but with very few feel no pain effects and very few ways to protect against mortal wounds. The new devastating wound mechanic causing that damage to simply be unsavable from outside of feel no pains and not carry over to new models in the unit means that large bricks of Terminators don't have as much to fear from big hits from devastating wound guns that would kill 2 or 3 Terminators at a time. Now only losing one of them makes them much more survivable against those types of attacks, and that's huge for Death Guard. This is another faction that's been changed so wholly that I don't know where to put them in an overall tier list, at least not right now. It may be that with the ability to stack multiple attack modifiers onto enemy units, giving them -1 to hit, -1 ballistic skill, minus toughness, minus damage, if they stack all of their defensive characteristics together, they can be as tanky as the Death Guard we remember, or at least tanky enough to dominate primary and secondary objectives. The maneuverability of the faction is still called into question, but Chaos Demons did see some beneficial changes for Death Guard as well, with a lot of their especially Nurgle-aligned demons going down in cost. A Great Unclean One now costs 250 points, can be included in your army as a Deep Striker, and also passes out an additional -1 toughness, allowing you to stack it with Contagions of Nurgle. With a unit that expensive, I'm not sure that's necessarily a particularly strong combo, but there are at least lots of those within the Death Guard Codex, and I think most Death Guard players are going to be including at least a couple of Nurgling units to shore up their secondaries, and again, stack multiple minus hit effects on their opponent, both -1 weapon skill and ballistic skill from their Contagion, and -1 to hit from the Nurglings themselves. Lots of interesting play within the Death Guard faction now, and they were a faction that really needed it. Being slow, expensive, and not particularly survivable, they now have a lot more interesting tools to play with, and I'm excited to see them moving on into the future of the season. There are also some other honorable mentions that I'd like to include that are largely buffed by changes in the metagame more so than actual mechanical changes. We saw some side grades in Necrons where some units were increased in cost and some units were lowered in cost, but largely the faction remained relatively unchanged, and the change to Devastating Wounds is another one that massively buffs Necrons, who love to take big bricks of multi-wound units, and now will no longer be taking that excess damage from Devastating Wounds on things like Lich Guard, Warriors, or their Destroyer units. That's huge for the faction, and getting big points costs on things like monoliths and characters like the Silent King and Illuminor Ceres is pretty solid for them. In addition, Orcs saw basically no changes as well. They unfortunately did get some points increases to their light vehicles like trucks and mecha guns, but almost all of their infantry and many of their characters dropped enough as well that the points changes were more of a side grade. And again, with less predators in the metagame and a game plan already reliant on incredibly powerful scoring, Orcs are largely going to be able to push their way to the top tables of events in the near future. It'll be interesting to see whether these end up ringing true through moving on into the new ecosystem and how the metagame shakes out, and if you have any other picks for factions that were the most improved in this new Autumn 2023 balanced data slate, let me know down in the comment section. Big thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks as well to everybody who supports the channel either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. All you people are great and I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.